Hello. Today I am going to talk about my October reads or my October wrap up. And I read 7 books, but I'm going to include one book that I didn't talk about in September. So the first book I finished September 30th was The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. And this is definitely a classic story. Everybody should read this. I've read this 3 times already. I think it's really wonderful and it's really well done. This one I rated a 5 out of 5 stars because it made me laugh, and it always makes me laugh. Throughout the story, it gets quirkier and weirder and different, and it's very L. Frank Baum has a very vivid imagination. He's definitely creative in what he does. The next book I read, or short story I read, was The Lottery by, I don't really remember the last name, but that one, I think it's by Shirley Jackson. And this one I read on the computer, and this one I gave a 4 out of 5. This one was a short story. It was only like a page. I listened to it on audiobook, and I had a printed document that I found on the computer. I really enjoyed that one. It was more of a thinking book and not less of a horror, but it's like about a society, like a small town society, and how they kind of get rid of people. And that's all I'm gonna say. So, in case you want to read the story. The next book I read was The King in Yellow and Other Stories. I also read this on audiobook, and I only rated this a 3 out of 5. Now, this book was really, really creepy. Some of the stories were not as creepy as I thought that maybe, I wished that it would be more creepy, but some of the stories were really creepy. Other stories, like my favorite story was The Yellow Sign. You should definitely read that one, because that one's creepy. Like, oh my gosh, like you could get nightmares from that one. That one was a really good one. And yeah, the next book I read for Little Book Hours Book Club was Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This one was an amazing book. Like, I read this in like 4 days, I think, and it was really amazing. Like, it was amazing. It's about 2 guys named, obviously I have a review for it, so link down below. But this book is amazing, and it has a really big twist, and it's really great. And I really recommend reading this and picking this up. This was a great, like, Halloween horror movie, or not horror, but it was a great Halloween read. And it's kind of spooky and creepy and has elements of that. So yeah, really good. This is about superpowers and how they how to become a superhuman and have superpowers. The next book I read was Battle Royale. Angel's Border, and story is by Kadusha Tamaki, and the art is by Makoto Onshi and Yohaishi Ogba. And this is 2 different stories, and it's a graphic novel, and it's really amazing. Like, this one I rated 4 out of 5, and I did like this one. But I didn't like the second story. It was 2 separate stories. The first story was called... Hold on. The first story was episode 1, and then there was episode 2. So, yeah. So, there's 2 episodes in there, drawn by separate illustrators, not authors, illustrators. It's written by the same guy who wrote Battle Royale, the book, and the graphic novel. So yeah, I really this one was interesting. If you've seen the movie, it's really relatable and goes in depth to these minor characters. I really love this book. The next book I read was Horns. This one took me a little while. This one is about a guy named Egg. And I really love this cover. But this is a guy named Egg, and he gets horns, basically. And crap happens, and yeah. It's really, really good. It's a mystery, though. It's not horror. I wouldn't call it horror. It's kind of got that Stephen King vibe, but it's not horror. This is definitely not horror. It's a thriller, interesting, and yeah, all these symbols, like the pitchfork has a thing in the story, the bradle, or it's not bradle, but it's the dash, the code that has the symbol in the story. And there's a lot of interesting. There is a movie out by the same movie, and once I see the movie, then I will do a book and movie adaptation, because yeah, it's interesting and good. And the next book I read on my iPad, I think, and it's called The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And this book I rated 4 out of 5 again. I rated it 5 out of 5 when I first read it, but I think it's a 4 out of 5 book. It is really interesting, and I love the it's told in another person's perspective, and you know, they are kind of spying on Dr. Jekyll and figuring out what Dr. Jekyll's science project is, and you know, what he's getting into himself, why he wants to be alone. It's really interesting and very good read. Then the last book I read, and I read and listened to it on audiobook, and this was 11/22/63. This was a 4 out of 5 stars as well. I didn't want to rate it a 5 out of 5 because I didn't get the whole experience in the audiobook form, and the voice guy was very boring, like he was monotone, like sometimes. But I loved the effect of time travel. This is about a story about this guy who goes and finds a rift that leads to a certain year, like in the 50s and stuff. And he gets this request from this guy named Al to go and, you know, make sure that JFK does not get murdered. And shit goes crazy. Things get torn apart. Yes. And this is not really scary as well. It's more of a thinking book to me. Because it kind of makes you think of, like, how could you change the past if something you didn't want, if you don't want something to happen, could you change the past, and would you? And why that would have consequences in the real world. I really like this book as well, and I highly recommend it. And that was it for my October reads.